director of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation, and I welcome you to a very special evening with Joyce Maynard. How can a writer tell the truth without laying waste to the privacy of others? I mean, that's hard to do in normal conversation, let alone in printed word. So tonight, New York Times bestselling writer and a very special friend of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center, Joyce Maynard, will explore the tough questions facing a writer of personal narrative, both from her experience as the author of hundreds of personal essays, as well as her memoir, At Home in the World, which just happened to be my favorite memoir of all time. It's fabulous. So we welcome her, and after we're done, we have some books for sale, and we'll have questions and answers. So thank you very much, Joyce, and welcome.
Says on. Yes, just had to warm up. Good. I have a way of speaking up. Tonight we're going to talk about the writing of memoir. I'm going to talk about how I became a writer of memoir. But I also am guessing and hoping that there are people in this room who, in one form or another, have been interested in the thought of telling their story. And I wanted to make myself available to you to offer some advice, guidance, inspiration, and to answer the questions that may come up. And just in case you don't have questions, I brought this little, this is actually one of my husband's razor blade boxes, but I'm going to interview myself. I have a few questions that come up a lot for people who are writing memoir, and so I'm going to anticipate some of your questions and ask them of myself and then answer them. But of course, we want to get to your questions as well. Some of you may know that if you're familiar with my work, my last few books have been works of fiction, have been novels. But I have gone back at many different stages of my life to telling my own story, and all of my other stories really come out of my own story. I think that's true of all of us. Every fiction writer, if you're very familiar with a fiction writer's work, you know some things about that person's life, whether or not he or she has written a memoir. So I thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit about how I came to write memoir. I grew up, like a lot of people in this room, in a family with some trouble. My father was an alcoholic. My parents had a very difficult, lonely marriage, and we didn't talk about it. We talked about many things. My parents were gloriously articulate people. They were people who loved language and loved to talk, but they did not talk about the big central issue of my father's drinking, ever. The word alcoholic was not spoken in our house for the first 18 years of my life. I thought I was the only person whose father got drunk because I kept the secret. I didn't invite people over to our house. I certainly didn't share that information because I didn't want anybody to see the holes in my boots. I have a feeling we're going to be using this metaphor tonight. And when I was always a writer. When I was 18 years old, I sent some of my writing off to the New York Times, published an article about my life, my growing up, certainly not mentioning some of the most difficult parts of my growing up. And I got a book contract and published the next year, when I was 19, a book. If there are some 61-year-olds in this crowd tonight, or some 62-year-olds, especially if you were on the East Coast during that period, you might remember that article and the book that followed. It's called Looking Back. And it was the story of my life, as much as I had a story at that point. I was 19. In the 165 pages of my first memoir, you will find no mention of my father's drinking, the difficulties in our family, the fact that as I was writing that book, I was suffering from pretty severe eating disorders, or the fact that I had dropped out of my Ivy League university, Yale, after my freshman year, to go and live with a 53-year-old man who had invited me to come and be with him, whose name was J.D. Salinger. And we're not going to, if you've heard me speak before, you have probably heard me say some of that story, so that's not the story for tonight. But there's no way that I can talk about the issues of writing authentic memoir without telling you some about my inability to write authentic memoir when I was young, because I was the keeper of secrets. I was first the keeper of my father's secret, and then I was the keeper of the Salinger secret. I was absolutely forbidden to say that I lived with him, to say that he was in my life, to have anybody come to the house once again. And when the relationship ended, as it did catastrophically for me 11 months later, when I was 19 and a half, and I was sent away from his home and from his world, in a way that now would that would bring me to call him into question, but at 19 only caused me to call myself into question. I knew that I was absolutely forbidden to ever speak of him. And for 25 years, I never did. Even to my first husband, to my quite good friends. Probably not a week of my life went by that somebody didn't call and ask about this, because it was kind of known I had lived with him, and I always said, I do not speak of Salinger. I took upon myself the obligation to protect the secrets of the great man. And I pretty much held to that until I was in my early 40s, and I know exactly what changed it. My daughter, the oldest of my 3 children, turned the age that I was when everything had changed in my life, 18. By this time, my marriage had ended. I had been writing for years, and I had been writing lots of personal essays. If some of you read my old newspaper columns or magazine articles, I did, in fact, eventually write about my father's drinking and my divorce and eating disorders and being a single parent and my sad attempts at finding love in my 30s as a single mother in small-town New Hampshire. But there remained one very large piece of my experience that I could not mention in my writing. And the writing was less authentic for it, because there is no way you can tell some of the truth and walk around it. Because when one large event has taken place in your life, its ripples are carried out over all the lake. When my daughter turned 18, I found myself increasingly returning to the despair that I had felt when I was very young. And I didn't really understand what was going on. I'd been living a sort of a happy, functioning life, but suddenly as I saw my daughter going off into the world, I felt a kind of panic. And it was actually a very dear friend of mine who was a Vietnam vet, who suffered from pretty severe PTSD, who, witnessing me that year, said, "My God, Joyce, what happened to you when you were 18 years old?" His own PTSD breakdown had occurred when his son turned the age that he was when he went off to the Tet Offensive. And I knew very well what had happened when I was 18. And the next weekend when my children went off to be with their father, I took out a box of letters I had not looked at in 25 years, the letters sent to me by Salinger, the man I had worshipped as the repository of all wisdom and knowledge and spiritual elevation. And I read the letters no longer as an 18-year-old girl in love, but as a 42-year-old woman. And the story looked different, and I decided to write a memoir, a different memoir from the kind I wrote when I was 19. That book became this, At Home in the World. It was a very difficult book to write. For a year and a half, I could not write the book. I was absolutely frozen. I had actually left New Hampshire. I think I left New Hampshire, my home state where I'd lived for 42 years, because I knew I could not explore that story as long as I lived in that place. And so I came to California, where I knew nobody, where I was an invisible person in many ways. I actually knew the Arikans, but I didn't know hardly anybody else. And for the first time in my many years of writing, I could not write. And then I felt a compulsion, and this is something that I think if you're writing memoir, you need to honor, to do your research, not necessarily your research going through your genealogy and looking at every letter that your grandparents have ever written, but your emotional research. I needed to go back to the place where an event had taken place that had shaped everything else in my life. And I got on a plane and I went back to New Hampshire with no real thought of why I was going back. And when I landed, I knew that I was going to go and see Salinger. I hadn't seen him in 25 years. I had lived under the specter of the fear of his disapproval if I ever spoke of him, if I didn't speak of him and he still disapproved of me. And I knocked on his door. And it was the experience, and I'm going to go back to that a little bit later this evening, but it was the experience of confronting my greatest fear and the person who embodied it. The man who had presided over my life and found me unworthy more than half my lifetime before, that freed me to write the book. At Home in the World was published in 1998. It's a book I'm very proud of. It's a book that was a disaster in my professional life. If you were reading book reviews in bookstores, listening to the radio in the fall of 1998, you probably heard some things about me, and they probably weren't very nice. It was hard to find a good review of this book. Many reviewers actually proudly announced, I wouldn't think of reading this book. This is exploitation of an important writer. She hasn't written anything like Catcher in the Rye. She's exploiting his fame. She's dragging out her dirty laundry. It's one of the reasons why I feel that I can do this rather presumptuous thing of teaching memoir, of suggesting to other people how they might tell the story of their lives, because I have confronted huge disapproval and opposition in the telling of my own story. The New York Times published an editorial about this book. The Washington Post called it the worst book ever published. I was rather proud of a reporter for Time magazine said, well, the one good thing about At Home in the World is now that Joyce Maynard has published this book, we'll never have to hear another word from her again. That's her one story. And that, of course, was a kind of challenge. And in fact, I want to say this to those of you who are carrying around an untold story. It is the telling of the shameful story that releases all the other stories. Sometimes when I'm teaching memoir or when I'm hosting a memoir workshop, somebody will say, you know, I really want to write novels. I'm a novelist. I want to be a fiction writer. And I say, great, come to my memoir workshop. Once you have explored your own story, there will be riches in it that will direct you to all the other stories that will follow, that still come out of the obsessions of your experience, and you're now free to tell them because you're not carrying around that old piece of baggage, as I was for a quarter of a century. The single word that was most regularly applied to this book was shameless. And I mention that because I am indeed shameless, and I hope I raised shameless children, and I try very hard to encourage shameless writing. I think there's altogether too much shame in the world. And there are a few things that people should be ashamed of, but telling the truth should not be one of them. So that's my story. I mentioned that this was sort of disastrous in a career way, and it was. The book did not do well, and I could not get a book contract, couldn't sell a book for years after that. I no longer had an agent, I no longer had a publisher. I actually started teaching memoir kind of because I had to, but I discovered a wonderful thing when I began hosting my memoir workshops, first in my home in Mill Valley, and eventually in Guatemala and other places, and now here, which is that I love to teach. And I particularly, although I write fiction, I particularly love to teach memoir. And I love to teach memoir not just to people who have aspirations to be professional writers, give up their day job, sit on Oprah's couch, and sell 1 million copies, but because I think it is a unique aspect of memoir. It's not necessarily true of fiction, it's not true of poetry. I cannot make a person into a brilliant poet or fiction writer, but I have utter confidence that every single person in this room has a memoir in him or her. I know that. And so I never feel when I'm working with a student, oh, this is hopeless. There's no story to be told. There is the story in you, and it's a question of how to get it out. And so I thought we'd talk about that tonight, how you get the story out. And I have my trusty cards, but I'm most anxious always to hear from you. Where do I begin? How do you begin writing a memoir? It was a little easier when I was less daunting a task when I was writing my memoir at age 18, because I only had 18 years of life to explore, some of which I didn't remember very well because they were babyhood. But if you are in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, where on earth do you begin? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by it and to feel, oh my God, I have to begin with all those so far back. And I want to give you permission to forget about it. You begin exactly where you want to begin. You do not have to begin with your birth. In fact, your birth would probably be an inauthentic place to begin. Guess why? You don't remember it. And an essential element of memoir is, it is not the story. Your mother could tell the story of your birth. Maybe your father could tell the story of your birth. It is your story. It is the story seen through your eyes. And that is the essential difference between memoir and biography, memoir and resume, which is where a lot of people begin in the course of telling their story. Well, I grew up in New Jersey. I went to this school. My father was a truck driver. I married when I was 23. I had these children. I had this divorce. I moved to California. That's the events. It's not what they meant to you. And where you begin is not simply, you look at the events of your life, and then you go beyond the events of your life to how they shaped you and what they made of you and where you came out of the activities and the events and the timeline moments, what shaped you. So where you begin is probably not something you're going to know right away. Actually, the first thing that I always suggest for a writer is to not write, to think for a while, to maybe take a very long hike and maybe many long hikes, to clean your house extremely thoroughly, to iron a whole lot of sheets, to do something repetitive and contemplative and very simple that allows you to just be with yourself, something that I think we don't get to do very much in our lives, to be alone with ourselves. And very often, if the first image that comes to you will be a very telling one. This memoir begins with my house. And the first sentence of At Home in the World is when actually this is the prologue. The house where I grew up in Durham, New Hampshire, was the only one on the street with a fence surrounding it. Now, there were 1,000 details that I could have given about that house. It had a yellow door, it had a brick walk up the front, it was on a street called Madbury Road, there was an oak tree. But if I tell you there was a fence, there's a reason why I tell you there was a fence. I have chosen the detail that reveals to you a theme of my life then, a theme of our family. We were separate. We were isolated. We were not part of the rest of the world, or at least that's how I perceived it. And once again, this is not the story, it's my story. I was keenly aware of the fact that our family was different. Our family had a big secret. We had a fence. And there's no rule that you have to tell every single thing that happened. Many of the things that happened that are very important in terms of how your career developed, how your marriage played out, how your children were raised, will not be part of the story that you need to tell when you're looking at the story of your life. What you are looking for when you write memoir are the themes of your life, an arc that follows, that carries through. If music has been a part of your life, all your life, then probably we are going to begin with you and music somewhere. The first guitar you ever had, the first record album you ever bought. And probably we're going to carry you through with music at all the stages of your life. If you're a person who grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household and a struggle of your life, a theme of your life, is breaking away from the constraints of the religion as you saw it, again, as you saw it, then we're going to begin there, and we're going to follow to where you are now, because an essential element of a good memoir is watching a person grow and change and discover, and not simply move along the timeline of the events, but the internal growth that comes out of the events. Oh, here's a big one. I actually have to save this one. I don't remember enough. I don't remember enough to tell the memoir. Well, two things I'm going to tell you. One is you're going to remember more than you think once you sit down to write, and once you put away all the other things that distract you. When I wrote this book, I actually knew I was going to be going back to some very disturbing parts of my life, and I didn't really want to do it in my house with my children around. My two sons were teenagers at that point. They were still living at home. My daughter had left, and I felt I didn't want to be cooking dinner every night at the end of a day that I had spent looking at some of the darkest times of my life. So I left home. It was a luxurious thing to do, and not something that a person can do who has a regular job. My job has been writing for 42 years. But I went to a little cabin in Oregon for 4 weeks and hardly came out, because I knew that if I were grocery shopping and cleaning the house and doing the laundry and checking in on my son's homework, I would not hear the interior voices that did begin to speak to me when nobody else did. I thought that I had about 10 pages to say, maybe 5, about the period of my life in which I lived with Salinger and the period after, when I was cast out from him. Instead, I discovered I had about 200 pages. But I would never have discovered those memories if I hadn't shut out all the static of the rest. And one of the things you can do to help you remember, in my case, I mentioned music before. Music's a very important part of my life. You play music. You eat foods that remind you of things. You look at a movie that you watched when you were that age. You pick up a book. You certainly look at photographs. You do look at letters, but I always am a little concerned when memoir students of mine get too much involved in the research. And sometimes I have one student who's a wonderful writer, and she has been researching her family's history for about 10 years and not writing, because she has such mountains of research now that she has sort of buried herself in the research. My own belief is that the things that are most important to be in your story, you don't have to dig up. You know them. They are in there already. And so I encourage you to read some letters and to go back and talk to some people, but ultimately, when you begin talking to other people, you're getting their memoir, not yours. And it is a human impulse, again and again, to put ourselves away and look at the other person. Tell me about what this was like. And then you'll find out how life was for your sister or your mother or your uncle. But it won't be your story. You can have 5 siblings living in the same household, and every one will have a completely different experience of that household. As I know very well, because my sister, I'm one of 2 siblings, my sister also happens to be a writer, also has written a memoir, and our memoirs are totally different. Our memoirs of the same years, the same family, the same parents, because we saw them through such different eyes. Isn't it self-absorbed to write a memoir? Well, yes, it is. And I'll only suggest, what is the alternative? For me to write your story or your story, I think that would be really presumptuous. There is only one story that we truly own. I have no right to speak. Certainly I didn't really have a right to tell about Salinger, to tell the story of Salinger. Sometimes this book will be described as, oh, you wrote the book about Salinger. I couldn't write a book about Salinger. I can only write a book about me. But as I write a book about me, other characters will come into the story. And then I will write how I experienced those characters. Did I drop some questions? Maybe these are ones that I've already answered. Oh yeah, this is the one that we have to get back to. Can't I just tell the happy parts? And I love those people, and they tend to be really nice people, but they're not going to be the best memoir writers until they get over that. Because as lovely as the happy parts were to live through, it's very often the sad parts that shaped us. And when I think about who I am today at age 61, about to turn 62, the experiences in my life that have brought me to where I am are seldom the wonderful times at the football game or the happy moments making pie with my children. They are the moments of disharmony and trouble and pain that caused me to grow, to feel and to grow. I'm going to hold this one off. This one kind of comes after that. Can I just tell the happy parts? Every now and then, I've taught hundreds, probably over 1,000 now, writing students memoir. And about 5 times, I've met somebody who really didn't have any problems in their life. And this is a terrible handicap for a writer, I will say. I don't believe it's insoluble. It's actually very refreshing. There's one memoir, one of my all-time favorite memoirs, is a memoir of happiness, basically. It's Russell Baker's Good Times. And although Russell Baker grew up very poor in the Depression, he really did have a happy childhood. And it's sort of a delightful book to read for the happiness. But even in Russell Baker's happy childhood, there was trouble. And I strongly suggest that if you're going to write memoir, you look to where the trouble happened, because that's where the tension happened, that's where you were challenged, and that's probably where growth and revelation occurred. There are so many great writers already, and I'm not one of them. Why should I write my memoir? And I will tell you, this could get in the way of your fiction writing career. You will probably not become Philip Roth. But even Philip Roth, even whoever it is that is your great writer, Alice Munro, even the great writers cannot be as great at telling your story as you. And that is the great gift that it's why I love teaching memoir to people who have an interest in writing, because this is the story nobody can take away from you. If you say, I really want to write this love story about, a man and a woman, and there's another person that comes into their relationship, and there's trouble, and that may have been done before, and possibly done so well and so many times that it'll be hard for you to do that one in a new way. But there's one story that nobody else can tell, and that nobody else has ever lived, and that nobody else knows. And that's the one that I would encourage you to begin with. I'm not that interesting. And often then the person will say, but you should hear about my grandfather. He invented the washing machine. He created a pogo stick company that made $1 million. He climbed to the top of Mount Everest naked. It is not, and here I swear to you, and I know this is true, I have read memoirs that had no excitement and energy about huge accomplishments, famous people, big moments, big events. It's the great memoirs do not come out of having a grandfather who was once on top of Mount Everest. They come from authenticity and truth. It is unmistakable and riveting every time. If you are willing to look at your own simple, ordinary seeming life, it will be extraordinary, because so few people really are brave enough to do it. Why should anyone care? Why should anyone care about my life? Why should I do this very presumptuous thing of asking you to read 300 pages about me? And I would say, because if you read about me, you may discover some things about you. You may discover, and it is the part of memoir that is not self-absorbed, and that I think is even generous and maybe the most helpful thing that I've ever done for anybody in my life, is to tell the difficult stories that may make their own difficult stories feel a little bit easier, or at least make them feel less alone. And I go back to the girl I was growing up in that alcoholic family, who didn't know anybody else's father got drunk, who didn't know when I carried around the story, as I did, within me, never spoken, of the shame that I felt at age 19 and 23 and 30 and 35 about having failed to win, or at least maintain, the high regard of this great man that I had worshipped and loved and left college for and left my life for in so many ways. I did not know that is not simply my story, it's many women's stories. And one of the things that happens when you tell your story is you hear back. You hear other people's stories. They hear your story, you hear theirs, and suddenly neither of you is alone anymore. There were a couple that I put away before. What if I get sued? Well, and this is actually connected to my family will be upset. I won't be invited to Thanksgiving dinner. First off, you will have, if you get to the point of your family being upset and a big lawsuit being filed against you, it does mean that one very good thing has happened. Your memoir has been published. So don't worry about it until that very good day occurs. But seriously, I believe even if nobody is ever going to read the memoir, you need, or if 1,000 people will read it, or one, you need to operate in the same way, which is with total freedom. Total freedom. There are so many ways that our freedom is curtailed and limited in our lives. We don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough health. We cannot do so many of the things we'd like to do. But let us at least be able simply to tell our story, and let our only limitation be our ability to write it honestly and well. And if in the course of telling that story, you tell some uncomfortable truths that may upset somebody, consider them after, not during the writing process. Experience the total freedom while you're writing of telling it the way you meant to tell it. And if you later have to put it in a drawer until your mother dies, or possibly change things, at least know the experience of telling it right one time, of having told it, and of feeling what you feel when you tell the truth, something that some people have never fully done. And it is the great joy that I experience every time I teach memoir. Sometimes it's a one-day class, and once a year I teach an 8-day workshop that I am happy to tell you about afterwards if anybody's interested. I teach an 8-day memoir workshop in Guatemala. And every single year in that circle in Guatemala, there will be probably not just one person, probably 3 or 4 or 5, who sit in that circle of total strangers looking out at that volcano and say, I never told this to anybody in my life before, but. And maybe they won't publish the memoir, maybe they won't be able to show it to anybody, will not go to their grave having held the shame of their secret. 2 years ago, there was a woman who sat in that circle who'd had an illegal abortion in 1967. She'd never told her husband. Her husband, who loved her dearly. She went home and she felt she could. And she has not published her memoir. She's written some lovely essays. She's not giving up her day job. But the telling of that story changed her life. I truly believe it. And it's one of the reasons, again, why I feel there's no way that writing a memoir isn't going to be a positive experience. I'm such a complete booster on this memoir business, but because it's not as if you have to get it published for it to be a worthwhile experience. You have to go to the story, find out what the story is, and that's the first tall order, knowing what your story is, and then tell it. And you will learn things yourself that you never knew. I do want to say something about my family will be upset, and I'll give you a story from my own family. When I wrote this book, of course, all the important literary people were very concerned about how I was going to upset J.D. Salinger. He wasn't going to like it that I told the fact that when he was 53, he wrote many letters to an 18-year-old girl and suggested that she come and live with him. I actually, by the age of 42, I decided I didn't really need to protect J.D. Salinger, who hadn't protected me so well. But there were some people that I did feel a responsibility to. And one actually was my ex-husband, and I wasn't married to him anymore. I didn't particularly like him anymore, but we had entered into a marriage, a relationship of trust. And then there were my children, the children of that husband. And there was one particular story. My children grew up with me, and I was in recovery over holding secrets, so I tended to talk about a lot of things that some parents don't talk about with their children. And they'd heard a lot of embarrassing stories, and it took a lot to make them feel, oh my gosh, my mom is shocking, because I was kind of regularly shocking. But there was one particular story, and I'm going to share this one with you, that I knew belonged in At Home in the World. And I'll first tell you what the story was, and then I'll tell you my dilemma. And it had nothing to do with Salinger, because really this book was about me, not about Salinger, and it continued after the Salinger story finished, or at least after the events of being with him finished. The repercussions of the relationship affected me in many different ways for many, many years to come. I was married, I was living in New Hampshire, living a kind of, out in the backwoods kind of life. I had my babies at home. I was pregnant with my second child, and it was going to be a home birth, It was winter in New Hampshire. The snow was piled up very high. And I was 8.5 months, 8 3/4 months pregnant. My father, my alcoholic father, had been living on the West Coast, and I got a call from, I hadn't seen him for some time. He was not doing well. I got a call from one of his friends to say that he'd gone on a bender, he'd become very ill, he had pneumonia, and he was not going to live through the night. There was no way I could talk to him. He was in an oxygen tent. He was going to die, and he was going to die that night. I put down the phone, and my whole body began to tremble, and I felt the sickest that I felt in my entire life. And I began to weep, and I threw myself down on the bed, and I felt physically ill, and I paced the floor back and forth, thinking about my father, grieving for my father. And suddenly, in the midst of my grieving and my weeping and my flinging myself on the bed, I heard a sound come out of me that I had only heard one time in my entire life, and that was when my daughter was being born. And I realized that my baby was being born right at that moment. All of this transpired in about 10 very painful minutes. And although this was a planned home birth, it was a home birth that was supposed to be attended by a midwife, and there was no question of a midwife getting to our house in time. So I said to my husband, who had been watching the Boston Celtics on TV, I said to my husband, the baby is being born. And my husband said, I'll just go and have a cigarette. I'll be right back. And I did not say in a soft, level voice, please don't do that. I screamed, don't take one step. Stay right here. And my husband was not one to be told to stay if he didn't feel like staying. He went and he had his cigarette. And I doubt that he enjoyed it very much. I will add he didn't smoke, but he did smoke under stress, and clearly this was a stressful moment for him. And if he were writing his memoir, no doubt he'd have a story, and I do recognize that. It's actually helped me enormously get through life, that if there's a person that's really problematic to me, I just picture them in one of my memoir workshops, and I know they've got their story. But he went and he had his cigarette, and I managed to not give birth while he was smoking the cigarette, and he came back, and our son Charlie, 10-pound baby boy, was born. Steve knew to check for the cord around the neck, and everything was fine, and he came out pink and happy, and everything was great, and our daughter came down the next morning, and there was a baby in the house, and we began to tell the story, and I told it too, of the heroic way that my husband, her father, had single-handedly delivered this baby in the night. And we told it over and over and over again. It became the family legend. My son loved to tell how he was born in the middle of the night and his father delivered him. But I had a hard, bitter, angry, it was as if there was a piece of rotten fruit in my mouth every time I heard that story after a while. And I used to beg my husband to apologize, and my husband didn't take that very well, and it stayed with us. We didn't get a divorce that year, and we didn't get a divorce for many years. We did eventually get a divorce, and it was a very bitter, angry divorce for many years. And at the point that I was writing this book, my son Charlie was 16 years old, and he had never heard that story. And I really knew that story belonged in this book. And if I were going to do the thing that I've just advocated for everybody in this room as they tell their story, tell the truth unblinkingly, shamelessly, fearlessly, tell the truth about not necessarily all the big important events, your college graduation, the day you got the big promotion, but the day that Charlie was born was one of the turning points in my life and in my marriage, and I never fully trusted my husband again after that night. The story belonged in the book, but like women who are also writers and writers who are also women, I felt my primary responsibility to protect my son. I didn't want him to be hurt by this, and I decided that I would talk to him about the story before I wrote the story. So I had this conversation in the place that one has a conversation when you, with a 16-year-old, and you know that they are not going to enjoy that conversation, in the car on Route 101 heading north, where I couldn't look at him and he didn't have to look at me, but he couldn't jump out of the car. And I told him the story in a very level, flat, non-dramatic way, not at all the way I would have written it, which would have been for maximum drama. Maximum drama, but not maximum anger, because anger does not sit well in a memoir. When you're writing out of anger and revenge, it has a smell, and the reader will not want to be there for it. But I told Charlie the story, and I had this knot in my stomach. I'd been preparing this for days, and when I was done telling the story, my 16-year-old kind of chuckled, and he said, "Well, that sure sounds like Dad." And incidentally, he loves his dad. He truly loves his dad, and he loves his dad for all the reasons he should love his dad. But he doesn't love his dad out of any illusion that his dad would be the greatest guy in a farmhouse in New Hampshire with me giving birth all by himself. And I did put the story in the book. And what I came to feel was that, in fact, although I had protected Charlie from that story, I had in no way protected Charlie from my bitterness and anger towards his father. I had not spared him an awful divorce. Those pieces of, incidentally, that's his story. That's a story he's experienced. Those pieces he had in his life. He was fully aware of those. And I had deprived him of a piece of his history, the night of his birth, in fact, that would help him make sense of it. And that is, in fact, what I believe truth-telling does. It helps us to make sense of our lives. There are some stories that I haven't told, and sometimes it's a matter of when you tell them. There are stories, I certainly didn't write about for many years I wrote a weekly newspaper column about our life and my life as a mother, and it was for a while my life in my marriage. I didn't write about my daughter getting her period when my daughter got her period. That wouldn't have been a good thing for a 12-year-old girl to have that story in the newspaper. I could write it now. She's 37. It would be fine. I think I've talked enough about memoir for the moment. What I'd like to hear at this point, and it's always my favorite moment in one of these evenings, is when I get to hear from you, and we have microphones, I believe, that Vicky's ready with. So please don't be shy. If you're somebody who wants to read a memoir, who wants to write a memoir, or just somebody who reads memoir and is curious about memoir, go for it. Sometimes I charge the big bucks for this, but tonight it's free. So Vicky, here we go. What's your name? Victoria, great. Are you a writer, Victoria?
Yes.
Great.
And I actually was in your memoir writer's workshop the same time that the sisters were.
Oh, yes. And
yeah,
you know what happened to those?
I do. So I have a couple questions and one comment. The one comment.
You looked. I was trying to think if I knew you from somewhere. A long time ago.
So in this workshop, there were, 10 or 12 of us, and it was interesting. Yes. We didn't know each other except for the two sisters. And we all, though, happened to sit in a way. I'm widowed. 3 widows sat together.
Yes.
Somebody who had adopted a daughter and actually had been adopted were sitting together, and it was just interesting the way we kind of fell into the circle.
It happens many times.
I will say a little plug, and she did not know I was coming. She did not remember me. But I will say that her writer's workshop was transformative, and I will say it's one of the highlights for me, and I was absolutely amazed at her magical ability to be able to get our stories out.
I'm going to give you a scholarship to that.
I'm just saying that each and every one of us, through questions, and you had this big piece of paper where you would do these outlines.
Now I've graduated to a whiteboard.
So a whiteboard.
Yes.
And it was absolutely amazing, and
it
was riveting.
Victoria, I bet you, I want you to ask your question, but I think that was the workshop. There were the other 2 widows had a plan to write a book
Yes.
about how wonderful their
Yes.
husbands had been.
Yes.
And it was basically all about their wonderful, perfect marriages
Yep.
and their perfect husbands. And I know they loved their husbands, and
Right.
I know they were deeply grieving their husbands. But there was something, and they were going to give tips
Yes.
for
How to
widows.
get through
of,
this.
like,
Yes.
you know, start jogging and
Right.
you know,
On a
lots-
shopping binge. Yeah.
get a really good hair cut. But I had this feeling that there was something more. I never instantly. I do not tell the secrets of people from them, but you don't know who they are, so I can say this. I had a feeling that there was something more. This gets to the point of it's not the happy stories. That one of the women was carrying this pain that was different from the pain of the loss of her husband, and I felt that he'd had an affair. You remember that?
Yes. That's
And I didn't
the
feel it was for
transformative.
me to say it quite, but I said, did you have some difficulty in your marriage around the time of his death? And as I recall, he had the affair, and then they got back together again,
Yes.
and then he died.
Yes.
So, and that was really the story, that she
Yes.
had sort of lost him twice.
Yes.
She had lost him twice. Now, which is the book you'd want to buy? The wonderful, happy stories about what a great golfer he was, and
Right.
how on her anniversary, he always gave her a really nice piece of jewelry, or the
And it was
struggle.
cathartic for her.
Yes.
And we all got to witness that. So that was absolutely amazing. So
I
yes,
hope
that
you're
was
still
the-
writing, because
So, I have remarried, and I have inherited 3 children. My husband is a widower as well, so
Wow.
my time is limited. But yes, this is hopefully my segue back into writing tonight.
Oh,
And
great.
having you as
great.
my yes.
Well, I will give a plug for since you recommended the workshop. I'm actually doing one of those workshops on December 5th. So
Oh, well,
right
and then
here in
my
Lafayette.
daughter is a writer, and so we might have to come together to that. But I have, so the 2 questions you
Right.
actually touched on one, and that's really writing about your children who are under 18. And I
Yes.
think you answered it in terms of choosing when you tell the stories, because there is trust, and you talk about your story. And I think that when you're an adult, the consent is different.
yes.
And but you did touch on be careful when you tell your story.
And that doesn't mean you shouldn't write them. I actually, when I was writing my domestic affairs column, my children were very young. And a lot of the early years of the stories were things that were, you know, it was the sort of the chaos of babies and toddlers. And and those were stories that I felt free to write.
Right.
But when there were emotional issues and a different kind of pain, I felt and actually I stopped writing the column at that point. And that's when I started writing fiction. Fiction which was still completely informed by my life. And that's why, you know, memoir is always there. You can you use your life as the engine that drives your writing. And the obsessions, if you read my fiction, you'll know a lot about my life too.
The second question is really more about the craft. So the 3 of us are writers, and I will say at least 2 out of 3 of us struggle with the same thing. So if you are doing a memoir and you've written about particular events and you feel that you've captured a particular chapter in your life very well, where do you start? You don't want to just do a simple chronology. Where do you start, and how do you weave these different passages together to have a complete thematic?
Well, I wouldn't worry about the weaving so much first. I would first write the thing that you most burn to write. You know, we do have computers that you can just cut and paste and move, and that's a nice problem to have, that you have 50 wonderful little stories and you have to figure out how to put them together. Write the wonderful little stories, and they will, I believe, reveal a shape for you. And it may or may not be chronological, and there's certainly not one rule for everybody's, but I would say begin where you feel most inspired to begin. If there's ever a story that you think, oh, I guess I've really got to write about, you know, how we moved to Orinda, if that doesn't feel like something that you're excited to be writing about, it will not be exciting for your reader to read. But if there's some odd thing that happened, maybe, you know, at age 31, that might be the beginning. And maybe later you'll talk about age 12. But begin with the thing that you can't not tell, and you will probably discover why when you write it. And that will, one of the questions I always ask when I'm workshopping a manuscript, I don't know if I was doing it, that was many years ago, but now I always begin, I say, what is this story about? And it should be the most, basic thing that every writer knows, but you'd be amazed at how many people sit down to write before they know what the story is about. That widow did not yet know what her story was about. She knew her husband had died.
That
she
day.
knew she was sad.
Yes.
But she didn't know the nature of the loss completely. Or at least she hadn't told it to herself.
Right.
She wasn't acknowledging it.
Thank
Just
you very
write.
much. Thank
Just
you.
start writing.
All right, thank you.
More. Don't be shy.
I have a question.
Yes. Oh, good.
I have one too.
Oh, good.
I'll ask it while I'm taking the
Yeah. Good.
the microphone over. Did you always feel liberated or free or open to be able to share
Not at
with
all.
your children?
Oh,
Did
with
you ever
my
feel a need to protect them from all of your truths?
By the time I had children, yes, because I was raised in a family where that was so much not the way that I think I knew very, very early on as a parent I was going to name it. I was going to, if a child thinks there's a monster under the bed, what do? You turn on the lights and you look under the bed. And suddenly it's not so scary anymore. But I didn't have that experience when I was young. I was a very fearful person. I was a very shame-filled person. And I was a very good writer, as anybody would have been who was raised in my family, and you'll read about that if you read at Home in the World. I grew up in a boot camp of writing. Some people played sports, some people, went bowling, some people went to football games. We wrote. That's what we did every day. We wrote, we read our work out loud, our parents critiqued it. And so we were very good writers, very young. But the emotional piece of knowing, of feeling brave enough to tell the truth, that's not a skill that was taught around our dinner table. But I did, okay, I think this group can handle this story. I was, and actually, this all credit goes to my son, not to me in this one. I was a single parent. I was by this time living in Mill Valley. I had sons who, the way our house was constructed, they had one entire floor downstairs. We all lived together, but their bedrooms were downstairs. And my sons were quite lovable guys to girls. And so there were a lot of girls coming and going, and I had a lot to say about how to treat women well, and they had a sister who also had a lot to say, and they did. And my son Charlie had a girlfriend who he really had a very serious relationship with. They'd been together for a couple of years. He had a little run-in with rear-ending a few cars, so he lost his license, and he couldn't drive her anymore. So sometimes she stayed over. And I chose to believe that she stayed over in the TV room. But Charlie was, yeah, I was young too. So Charlie was 16, his son Will, his brother Will was 14. And I come down one morning to just tell them the pancakes are ready, and lo and behold, the girlfriend is in bed with Charlie. And I didn't want to embarrass her by making a big thing about it. She was going to leave, but after she left, I said, Charlie, we have to talk about this girlfriend in the bed situation. Is not okay. And this is not, it's a very difficult thing. It's a moment when you really don't want to be a single parent. You want to have your fellow parent there, the dad, saying this. And I knew there was a reason why it was really not okay for his girlfriend to sleep over, but at that point, all I could think of was, sure, of course he'd want that. Who wouldn't? Sounds good to me. But I knew I had to be the authority figure, my least favorite thing to do. And I said, Charlie, this girlfriend thing, girlfriend in the bed, not okay. And I'm trying hard to sort of be firm. And his brother, who always kind of brought up the rear and was very forceful, he said, so Mom, what are you saying? Charlie can only have sex in cars? And I said, well, no, but, and then he said, so Mom, nobody ever slept over upstairs? And well, no, and then I said, well, I pay the mortgage. I had something really lame to say about that. And finally, I said, well, sex is private. It shouldn't happen with your family all around. I was really flailing at this point. My son was just pounding over and over again. And he said, okay, Mom, so tell me, does this policy apply to masturbation? So, yes, my children were quite free with speaking openly, and I like to think that by my speaking openly about my life, that gave them permission to speak openly about theirs. I'm sure if they were writing memoirs, they're not. They'd have no short list of things that were issues, but Shameful Secrets was not one.
Hi, my name is Danelle. I was interested.
Janelle?
Danelle, yeah. I was interested in what you said about revenge, how the reader can smell it.
Yes.
Because sometimes when you start writing about your life, you have a score to settle.
Yeah.
There's somebody in your life who is a villain. So is there an obligation in any way to be fair if you have a villain? I mean, of course, there are some situations where this person has done some harm to you.
Yes.
But on the other hand, you know, they live in their own context. They are citizens of their own world, much like you're saying how they could write their own memoir, which have a completely different point of view.
Yes.
So as you're exploring these episodes from your past, especially these ones that have emotional content that is difficult, do you have any obligation to be fair?
Well, you have an obligation to the reader, first of all, to not stack the deck. And many of the tools of good writing will protect you against that kind of revenge writing because it's lousy writing. If you say, you know, he sneered, you know, in a hideous way, you are denying me the opportunity to see that character clearly. You're giving me all kinds of overlay that no longer allows me to experience the scene. I'm experiencing your judgment. And of course, I've been saying all evening, the story you tell will be the story that you have experienced, not the truth. But you need to let the reader experience it for herself. And she'll come to her own conclusions. There, you know, I'll go back to At Home in the World. When I wrote about Salinger, I probably bent over backwards to not use adjectives, I do know adjectives, you know, that's like a part of speech that I'm quite familiar with, and I know some really good ones, but I wanted to leave it, I wanted to give you a movie to just sort of look at and figure it out for yourself. I certainly didn't use words of interpretation of what he was doing. I figured, I'll say what he does and let you figure it out. I have 42 years of publishing my work has given me huge respect for the intelligence of readers. If I say there's a 53-year-old man who's a very good writer, who writes utterly charming, irresistible letters to an 18-year-old girl, and I describe some of the things that are said in the letters, I think you'll figure it out. I don't think I need to say what that behavior looks like to me. And I actually have to add here that I don't see any of these people in my life as villains. I have been deeply hurt by some people, but every one of them I also know had his or her own damage that brought them to that place of hurting me. And it's part of the great gift of having heard as many stories and as many different workshops as I have now, that I can know that. Sometimes there'll be a person who comes to the workshop that usually I just sort of warm to everybody, but sometimes there'll be somebody that's really difficult. And then once I hear their story, suddenly it falls away. I've seen it again and again in Guatemala, where we get to be together for 8 days. By the end of the week, everybody loves that person because why? Because we know their story. And it is again, a reason to me for telling stories and for reading other people's stories, that when you do, I'll give you an example of a person that I have a really hard time with, and I can't say that this has like won me over, but it is the most interesting thing about this person, and that's George W. Bush. I really dislike George W. Bush intensely, intensely. He was one of my least favorite, presidents of all time. But there was one book that I read about the death of the sister in the Bush family. Do you remember there was a sister who died of leukemia? It's a fascinating book, and it is a book that I'm really not. I see my husband looking amazed because he hates George W. Bush even more. And I never told him that I had this little bit of sympathy. But when I read about the death of the 7-year-old sister and how those Bush parents didn't deal with it, just like shut it down, that was a little clue to George W. Bush that I didn't get during the White House years. Anyway, I'm not there yet, but yeah. You, yeah.
Hi, my
What's your name?
Frances Brown.
Francis, hi.
Hi. You mentioned letters earlier.
Yes.
And were you speaking of letters sent to you or letters that you sent to people, or both?
Well, at home in the world, isn't it sad that letters don't really come to us anymore? We have emails, but it's certainly not the same. I'm old enough that I got letters, and I wrote letters. I was a big letter writer. And so one of the things that I did when I was writing my memoir was to look at my letters. And my mother actually kept a lot of letters. But the particular letters that were central in this story were actually letters that Salinger wrote to me. And they were the basis for my intense attachment. They were, he had, just a little bit of the backstory, I had published this article when I was a freshman at Yale, what proved to be my one and only year of college, that got a lot of attention. It had a big picture of me on the cover of the New York Times, got hundreds and hundreds. I got 1,000 letters. And one was a letter from Salinger. And of course, that was a pretty special thing. Even in 1972, he was already a recluse. So I wrote back, and I had this correspondence. Those letters, I loved that man before I met him. I fell in love with him on the page, the way many readers have fallen in love with him, on the page. On the page is actually the place to fall in love with him. It's in real life that it got to be tricky. I had a very particular challenge in the writing of this book, that those letters were an extraordinarily important part of my relationship with him, of my forming the attachment to him, and of my whole history. 50 pages that utterly, took over my world. I was not legally allowed to quote those letters. And that has to do with a legal decision that was actually brought by Salinger in the 1970s. It said that is on the books to this day, which states that if I send you a letter, you own the physical document of the letter, but the language is mine. It's copyrighted. And if it's me, I'm probably not going to sue you. But if it's Salinger, look out. So I couldn't quote those letters, and it was very hard at the time that I was writing to convey how it felt to be me reading those letters without, and they were extraordinary letters, of course. They were written by J.D. Salinger. In the end, I'm glad that I was not allowed to quote the letters, because that would have become his story, and the story centered on my response to them, and I actually had to work harder to stay with my story, because I couldn't just say, and here's this letter. And it is something that a lot of people do in their memoirs until I've got to them, which is paste in a lot of emails and letters, and then, big, here's my journal entry. I want your voice now, not the excavation of the artifacts.
So an add-on question to that, I was given quite a gift about a month ago where someone gave me a stack of letters I had written to them between the age of 15 and 20, 50 letters.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if I use those in my writing. I'm just kind of a beginning writing just for myself. What is my responsibility? Can I use those letters as fact, or I don't remember?
Of course you
some
can.
of-
What I would
remember
suggest,
some-
you own, those are your language, so you own that language. The danger is not a legal one in this case, it's actually a writing one. I would suggest that if you have 50 pages of letters, it's going to be really important for you to read them all because it's your life. But for me, I want you to distill. I want to know what you know after reading 50 pages without reading the 50 pages. And I want a few lines, a few beautiful lines that will tell me what the girl was who wrote those letters. And then it becomes, then you're the editor of the letters. And that's a very important role for every writer, to be an editor of herself or himself. Good question.
Time for one more.
Yeah.
Hi, Joyce. Irene here. Irene Sardanas from Oakland.
What's your name?
Irene Sardanas from Oakland, California.
I think
And
we've met before.
we have.
Yes.
I'm a fan, and I've seen you at the Montclair Library, and I've seen you
That's right, yeah.
talks here. I never ever intended to write the memoir. It was only when I was at a workshop, a one-day workshop where you just wrote what you wanted and then what you wanted to share. And in it, I couldn't believe that I was writing once again, sickeningly so, about a beating that my mother gave me. And then I started to hear the voice that said, you better not tell anybody about this. You better not. And then I started answering, and I said, it's too late. You're gone.
Yes.
But that's not the reason. I have to.
Yeah.
I have to tell it, and I will. And you can do whatever you want, and it's amazing. I was writing in the garden, and I started to hear the birds, and I started to look at things differently around me. It was like a whole day of writing, but it was a catharsis for me to get
Yes.
to that point. Because I am Greek, and I'm not saying this, I don't know if anyone else is Greek here, but if you are, we are all afraid of the katara, the curse. You see, she's now I'm going to curse you, she said, from my graves if you tell the story.
Oh.
And I thought, oh my God, because it's very superstitious. This Greek stuff is very superstitious, and, you don't know why you're turning around and feeling like there's somebody following you, but it's like the katara is going to come, the curse is going to come, whatever's going to happen if you tell the story and tell the truth. But it is too late, because I am getting published in the Sun magazine in these little readers'
Whoa!
right.
That's one of my favorite magazines.
Oh, thank you. And I urge you all to, just send out pieces and see what happens. It's not just the whole story.
Isn't it interesting that the people that we tend to be most protective of are often the ones who are the least protective of us? The really, the people who were good to us, who were loving to us, we feel no need to just, we aren't quaking about them in our writing lives. But I've seen it again and again. The most abusive parents, the people who have done the greatest damage, are the ones who, 50 years later, their son or their daughter is still feeling, I must protect them.
Yes. I want to say something for the person who is afraid to deal with the villain, or that we don't, and that you wisely said that we have to see their side too. And so it was when my writing coach said, Irene, you need to write in her voice, in her skin. And when I started writing her voice of saying, my name is Maria, and I come from this island in Greece, and so forth, that I had at last begun to understand where she came from, and on the path of forgiving her. The understanding really had to come from there. But it was, I just adore you, and thank you so much for doing this today. Thank you.
Oh, it's
Joyce.
a pleasure. I wanted to end, if you will indulge me, in reading just a few pages from At Home in the World, because it really is about the moment that I gave myself permission to tell my story. I mentioned before that At Home in the World is not the story of Salinger, it's the story of me, but it is, the particular arc of this story does have to do with my freeing myself from the scars of that early relationship. It's not a book about my professional life, it's not a book about my mother life, those aspects come in. There's a very particular arc to this story, and because of that, it ends, or it comes right near the end, with a description of the trip that I made, and I mentioned it at the beginning of this evening when I went back to New Hampshire. I knew that I wanted to write the real story of my young life that I had not done when I was young, and I didn't know how to do it, and I got on the plane, flew to New Hampshire, and when I got to New Hampshire, only then did I know that I wanted to go see this man who I hadn't seen in 25 years, but who had had such a profound effect on me. And I'm going to read you just a couple of pages. Actually, this was 1997, and it was almost exactly, however many years ago that was, 20 years, I guess, 21 years. And it was just about exactly this day because it was right before my birthday, and it's right before my birthday again. And I don't think it was a coincidence that I suddenly felt this need to go back to New Hampshire on my birthday, for my birthday. By the time I get to Jerry Salinger's house, it's 4 o'clock. The last light of day is closing in. Dark clouds fill the sky. Dry leaves swirl around the wheels of my truck. I recognize the spot, though the only marker is the no trespassing sign still posted at the foot of the driveway leading up the steep hill to his house. When people made their pilgrimages to see him in the days when I lived here, they would park their car on the side of the dirt road and walk up the hill. Usually these visitors would be young people. I know when I reach this spot that I am not going to park. I'm driving up the hill. As I come over the crest, the house comes into view. A few years ago, I read there was a bad fire here, but he must have taken great care to rebuild the place. It looks exactly as I remember it. I turn off the ignition and get out of the truck. I look out at Mount Ascutney, watching the clouds building and the way the shadows fall over the field. His garden has been cleared for winter. I walk up the last stretch of the hill to the house. I go around the back to the door by the kitchen. My heartbeat is surprisingly steady. I'm standing at the door now, next to the bird feeder. Through the window, overlooking the doorstep, a young woman stands at the sink, washing dishes. She's a sweet-faced person with a no-nonsense haircut, dressed in a turtleneck and neat blue jeans. I ring the bell. The woman moves back and forth, in and out of view for a moment or two, then calls out through the window, not unpleasantly, "What do you want?" "I've come to see Jerry," I say. "Could you tell him Joyce Maynard's here?" The steadiness of my voice surprises me. A flicker of a smile crosses her face. She goes into one of the back rooms. "Someday you may find yourself in a situation where it may help you to say this word," he told me once. Om. There are certain moments in your life when all the senses seem to enter into a state of intensified acuity, and you notice every single thing. Your eyes take in more, and what they take in with a sharpness they didn't possess 10 minutes earlier and will not possess 10 minutes later. A cloud formation, a stick on the ground that looks chewed by a dog. You hear the sound your boot heel makes touching the rubber mat on the doorstep, and the pecking of a bird picking up a single grain of birdseed. You can feel your own blood moving through your veins. Childbirth was one of those times for me, holding a baby for a few hours at a time, watching her nurse. So was sitting beside my mother while she lay dying, and all I had to do was watch the breath come in and out of her. It's hard to say how long I stand on this doorstep. 5 minutes maybe, more likely 10. There is no reason in the world why he would come out of that room, only I know he will, and he does. All these years I have thought of him as such a tall man. Now, as Jerry emerges slowly from the bedroom and stands in front of me in the doorway, he seems shrunken. He is a little bent over. He's wearing a very fine bathrobe and slippers. He is thinner than ever. At 78, he still has all his hair. It is pure white now. He is clean-shaven, and his face is deeply lined. He does not invite me in. I remain standing on the step. I have never looked a man in the eye before who looked back at me with an expression of greater bitterness or rage. "What are you doing here?" he says. The words come at me spitting. "Why didn't you write me a letter?" "I wrote you many letters, Jerry," I say. "You never answered them." "What are you doing here?" he says. His voice comes from a place deep in the diaphragm. "I came to ask you a question, Jerry," I say. "What was my purpose in your life?" I would not have believed that a person could ever look more angry than he did the moment he first laid eyes on me. But now his mouth, which doesn't speak yet, curls as if he has bitten into a piece of fruit and found it to be filled with maggots. "What was my purpose in your life?" I say again. The image that comes to me is of Rumpelstiltskin, as I always imagined him, and even acted him out there on my bed all those years ago with my sons and daughter snuggled up beside me, that moment when the miller's daughter has one chance left to guess his name, or her baby will be lost to her forever, and she guesses right. That is how Jerry Salinger looks now when I put my question to him. "That question," he says, almost too angry to speak. That question is too profound. You don't deserve an answer to that question." "Oh, yes, I do," I say. I am still calm. I can feel warm water washing over me. I'm swimming my crawl stroke and my breathing is steady. I'm skating on black ice over Loon Pond on a moonlit night with Steve's arm around my waist. I'm cutting up apples for pie with a baby propped in an infant seat on the counter next to me. I'm hitting a tennis ball with my son under the lights at the Keene State Courts at midnight. I'm riding with my daughter on the chairlift, and I know just when to lift the bar and lower the tips of my skis. "You're writing something, aren't you?" he says. "I'm always writing," I say. "I'm a writer." I have never called myself that before. I have always left it that I write. "You're writing a book, aren't you?" he says. He says it as if it were a pornographic act. "I've heard you're writing some kind of a reminiscence." "Yes," I say, "I am writing a book." "You have spent your career writing gossip," he says. "You write empty, meaningless, offensive, putrid gossip. You live your life as a pathetic parasite." I am looking at his hands, his fingers wrapped around the belt of his bathrobe, the same long, elegant fingers that I loved, fingers that touched my naked skin before any other man had, before so many other things happened. "I'm not ashamed of the work I've done," I say. "I've worked hard to be an honest writer." He throws his head back as if to laugh, only no laughter comes out of him, only the stifled sound of the syllable, "Ha! You always did have an inflated notion of yourself and your so-called talents." "You know," I tell him, "I never took myself seriously as a writer until you told me I was one." He stands there for a moment. Then, taking a step backward, he raises his long, thin finger so it's pointing directly at my heart. "You, Joyce," he says, finger still pointing. You. His whole body is quaking and his eyes stare out at me as if he were beholding a sight of unspeakable horror. "The problem with you, Joyce, is you love the world." "Yes," I say, smiling. "Yes, I do love the world, and I've raised 3 children who love the world too." "I want to say goodbye to you, Jerry," I say. So, I have some books at the back. I'm very happy to sign books. I'm happy to tell you about writing workshops that you can take with me that won't be free, but that will be a little bit longer than this one and get a chance to show your manuscripts and talk to me about them. And I also want to let you know that for those of you who attended some of the conversations with writers that I had with my good friend Joe Loya, that we'll be back this year with more writers up on this stage. And I hope to see you again at this wonderful library. Thanks for coming. Hey. It's always so good to see your smiling face.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
You know, when I see you, I think, oh my God, they've heard everything that I have to say.
And I could hear it again.
Oh, so good. So I'm so happy you're writing.
thank
And
you.
you published something in The Sun?
Yeah, well,
What?
you know, one of the readers writes.
Yes, of course. That's so
Yeah,
important.
I mean, they edited the shit out of it,
Yep.
but I don't care.
Oh,
right?
yeah. It's out
In
now.
In July's issue.
Oh, I have it. Then
Leaving
I'll.
Home.
Leaving Home.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Irene said
Come
that
to
about
one of my workshops. I'm just down the road. Oh, I know. Yeah. Of course. Let me go back here. And oh, good. We've got a good pen here. Maybe I'll take this chair here. Oh, good. What's your name?
Alexandria.
Alexandria, not Alexandra. Okay, I'm glad you said that plainly. And are you a writer, Alexandria? Oh, good. Oh, great.
It's probably a coming of age, you know, for growing up in San Francisco, Chinatown, and I'm your age. So.
No, get out of here. Really?
And during the days of, you know, when everything was happening.
You didn't get in line?
Sure. John Lennon singing his peace things, you know, the whole bit and bringing it all together as being a Chinese person.
Yes. Yeah.
that's our
Oh. Oh, well, wonderful. And,
At least,
well, come to a workshop one day.
I'm sorry.
It's just www.joycemaynard.com.
Okay, I'm going to look.
joycemaynard.com, and you'll see. And if
Okay.
you register your name, then you'll also get notices when there are other workshops.
Oh, okay. Sounds great.
These are 16.
And you want to check? Not cash.
Cash or check?
Oh, I love it. I get a picture.
I'm still getting over that you're my age.
I just want to thank you, Joyce. That was absolutely
Oh,
terrific. That
thank
was
you.
wonderful.
Thank you for coming.
Really
Wow.
enjoyed it.
Well, I'll see you soon. Hi. Oh, good. Are you a writer?
No, not yet.
Oh.
I thought about it.
Yeah. What's your name?
Carrie.
Carrie.
Carry.
So something brought you to this evening, so maybe you were already thinking, oh, okay.
Well, but yes, it was kind of like, that's kind of a sign.
I live in Santa Fe, and I have a friend who knew I was out here and said,
Yes.
you must go.
Oh, great. I love it when I hear that. Wow. Well, what's your name?
Lynn.
Lynn, hi.
Yeah.
So you're visiting.
I am. I used to live here.
Uh-huh.
Where were you today?
Yeah, really.
Thank you. It was really nice to meet
A
you.
pleasure, a pleasure.
Yeah, when you, and then you can give it.
Oh, good.
So do you have a schedule of, is December 5th the Guatemala?
December 5th is a one-day workshop in Lafayette at my house. It's a one-day intensive, and you can read all about the workshops on my website. And also, if you register your address, then when if December 5th doesn't work for you, you'll get a notice. I do it 2-3 times a year at my home, and then Guatemala is in February, and that is a really wonderful week. It's the week, my favorite week of the year, and it's a beautiful place. So is this for you?
Yes.
Okay, and so what's your name?
Janet.
Janet.